My name is Sophia Miller, 27 years old, and I am a captain in the United States Army Medical Corps. I was smoothing the stiff creases of my camouflage uniform when my phone screen flickered to life in the dark. Area code 617. The house on Maple Street. 7 years ago, my mother stood next to my father on a graduation stage, gripped the microphone, and told 300 people that I, her second child, was useless. They threw me out with a single canvas duffel bag while handing the world to my perfect sister. Now, at 9:47 p.m., that same woman is sobbing into my ear. Her golden child is slumped on the floor with a needle in her vein, and they want the useless daughter to fly back and scrub the blood off the tile. They think a cracked voice and a few tears will make me roll over like a loyal dog. They have no idea what military discipline actually looks like. Leave your area code in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from your own blood to keep from drowning. The wall clock in the trauma bay hummed with a low clinical persistence that usually helped me tune out the chaos. 21:47. I was smoothing the stiff ironed creases of my OCP uniform, the digital camouflage pattern, feeling like a second skin after a 12-hour shift at the base hospital. My coffee had gone stone cold in its styrofoam cup, a thin film of cream settled on the surface like a stagnant pond. I was reaching for my bag ready to disappear into the quiet of my apartment when my phone decided to scream. It did not just ring. It vibrated against the stainless steel countertop with a violent metallic rattle that set my teeth on edge. I glanced down. 3 digits. 617. Newton, Massachusetts. The area code hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. It had been 7 years since I had seen those numbers on a screen. 7 years since I had been ushered out of a sprawling Victorian house on Maple Street with nothing but a canvas duffel bag and the echo of my mother's voice calling me a waste of potential in front of the neighborhood elite. I let it ring. Once, twice. The hospital lights above flickered, casting a sickly fluorescent pallor over my knuckles as they turned white, gripping the edge of the desk. I swiped the green icon. I did not say hello. I did not give them the satisfaction of an opening. The sound that came through the speaker was not a voice at first. It was a jagged, wet intake of breath, a sob that sounded rehearsed yet terrified. Then came the voice, the one that used to dictate the temperature of my childhood home with a single sigh. Sophia. My mother gasped. There was no, "How are you?" or "I have missed you." There was just the immediate suffocating weight of her crisis. Sophia, you have to come home. Right now. We have lost control. I leaned back against the cold wall, my eyes tracking a small crack in the ceiling tile. Lost control of what, Eleanor? The landscaping? The country club gala? It is Nicole. She hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper as if the walls in Newton were listening. She is in the bathroom. She will not come out. The vanity. There are needles, Sophia, little orange caps everywhere. She's barely 49 kilos. She looks like a ghost. I felt a dark, bitter spark of irony flare up in my chest. Nicole, the golden child. The one who had the 4.0 GPA, the vice presidency of the student body, and the bright future that justified my parents stripping my college fund to pay for her Ivy League tuition. Now the perfect one was a high-functioning addict crashing in a $1 million mansion. Call 911. I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. We cannot. My father's voice suddenly boomed in the background, muffled but sharp. He must have been leaning over her shoulder. Sophia, listen to me. If the police show up, it is on the record. The neighbors will see the ambulance. Nicole's career is just starting. You are a captain. You are a doctor. You have the credentials to get her into a private military-grade detox without the civilian paper trail. Use your rank. Do your job for once. The audacity of it made me want to laugh, but the sound died in my throat. 7 years of silence, and they did not want a daughter. They wanted a specialized janitor to scrub the blood and shame off their hardwood floors. My job, I asked, my voice dropping an octave, coming out in that low, dangerous tone I used when a private stepped out of line in the OR. My job was to be the useless one. Remember, The one who was a disgrace to the Miller name, because I did not want to marry a Hilton and play bridge? Why would Nicole even listen to me? You spent 20 years telling her I was not worth the air I breathed. The line went quiet. I could hear the hum of their expensive central air conditioning through the phone. My mother's breath hitched. That is not fair, Sophia. Fair? I gripped the phone so hard the casing groaned. The blue veins in my hand stood out like topographical maps of a war zone. Fair is you calling me after 7 years to apologize. Unfair is you calling me because you need a free high-ranking maid to hide your Golden Girl's oxycodone habit. She is dying. Sophia Eleanor shrieked, the mask finally slipping. I stood up. My boots clattered against the linoleum, a heavy rhythmic sound that grounded me. I was not that trembling 20-year-old girl on the porch anymore. I was an officer in the United States Army. I had stitched up soldiers under mortar fire while the smell of diesel and iron filled my lungs. I had seen real tragedy. This was just the rotting consequence of their own vanity. I will be there, I said, my voice cold and clinical like a surgical blade. But let us be clear about one thing. I am not coming as your daughter. And I am certainly not coming to save your reputation. I did not wait for a response. I tapped the red end call button. The silence of the hospital rushed back in, but it felt different now. Charged. I walked over to my locker, the metal door giving a sharp, hollow clang as I yanked it open. I unpinned my Captain Miller name tag from my chest, looking at the black and gold lettering. It was a shield I had built for myself far away from their judgments. I shoved the tag into my pocket and grabbed my car keys. The heavy brass rings jingled in the quiet hallway, a metallic countdown. They wanted a cleanup. They wanted someone to sweep the mess under the rug so they could go back to their perfect hollow lives. They had no idea that when a commanding officer enters a room, the first thing they do is secure the perimeter. And the second thing they do, they expose the threat. I walked out the automatic glass doors, the humid night air of the base hitting me like a warm blanket. My Ford F-150 sat alone in the gravel lot, its silver paint gleaming under the security lights. As I climbed inside and gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, my mind began to drift. The engine roared to life, but all I could hear was the sound of that canvas bag hitting the gravel 7 years ago. I put the truck in gear. I had a lot of questions to answer, but the biggest one kept looping in my head like a broken record. Why, after everything they did, was I actually going back to that house? The highway signs for Newton began to appear through the rhythmic swipe of my windshield wipers, and with every mile closer to exit 12, the air in the cab of my truck felt heavier. It is funny how a zip code can trigger a physical reaction, like a low-grade fever or a phantom limb ache. I was driving toward 47 Maple Street, a place that was never a home, only a fortress of high expectations and cold calculations. My father was the chief accountant for a major defense contractor, a man who viewed the world through the lens of a balance sheet, and my mother was a middle school principal who treated her family like a faculty meeting she was failing to chair. From the outside, the house was a masterpiece of suburban perfection. The white colonial paint was so bright it practically hummed under the streetlights, and the lawn was trimmed with the kind of precision usually reserved for military cemeteries. But inside the hierarchy was absolute, and I was at the very bottom of the chain of command. Every night at exactly 18:30, the ritual began at the dining table. It was a theater of systematic exclusion. My father sat at the head, his back straight as a yardstick, meticulously cutting into a rare steak. I can still hear the screech of his stainless steel knife against the fine porcelain plate, a sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. Nicole sat to his right, bathed in the warm glow of the chandelier, recounting her latest victory in the debate club or her perfect score on a mock SAT. I was relegated to the very edge of the table, the seat closest to the swinging kitchen door. It was the service position. I was there to fetch the extra napkins, to clear the salad plates, and to exist as a silent witness to their shared brilliance. My father would chew his meat, slowly swallow, and then let his gaze drift right over the top of my head as if I were a smudge on the wallpaper. He would ask Nicole about her future, and then without looking at me, he would drop that familiar leaden question into the silence. Why cannot you be a little more like your sister Sophia? He said it so often it became a part of the ambient noise of my life, like the hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the floorboards. The true nature of their investment became clear on the morning of April 12, 2016. The mailbox was the center of our universe that day. 2 envelopes arrived. Nicole's was thick embossed with the seal of a prestigious private university. She had been awarded a $15,000 merit scholarship. By 3 in the afternoon, my mother had already popped a bottle of expensive champagne, and the kitchen smelled like victory and yeast. My father was already on the phone booking a table at the Capitol Grill to celebrate the family's golden asset. I stood in the corner of the kitchen holding my own envelope. I had been accepted into the ROTC program. It came with an $8,000 student loan that I would have to carry, but it was my ticket out my way to serve. When I finally mustered the courage to slide my acceptance letter onto the counter in front of my father, he did not even pause his scrolling on his iPad. He just tapped his glass for a refill and muttered, "That is nice, Sophia. Now go get me some more bread." That night at the restaurant, the air felt thin. I sat there watching them toast to Nicole's bright future while I calculated the interest on a loan I would be paying off for the next decade. The bill came to $287. My father swiped his black credit card without a second thought, the price of a single dinner for his favorite daughter costing more than my entire wardrobe. The disparity followed us back to the house. Nicole's room was a 16 by 18-foot sanctuary with silk curtains and a $3,000 vanity set where she could admire her own perfection. My room was essentially a glorified broom closet at the end of the hall. My desk was a piece of junk I had salvaged from a dumpster behind a local office park, its laminate surface peeling back like burnt skin. I remember walking into the kitchen later that night holding a textbook on military tactics and asking my mother if I could have a new light bulb for my desk so I could study after dark. She did not even turn around from the sink where she was preparing the salad dressing for the next day. She just sighed a sound full of exhaustion and irritation. "Between Nicole's tuition and the renovations for her suite, we have spent quite enough this month, Sophia," she said. "You are a big girl. Figure it out yourself." The memory of that night, the coldness of the kitchen tile under my bare feet, and the way the light from the hallway seemed to avoid my door still makes my chest tighten. I was a ghost, in a house of stone, a secondary character in a story about someone else's success. But as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck, feeling the calluses on my palms from years of real work and real discipline, I realized that their rejection had been my greatest training ground. They thought they were starving me, but they were actually making me lean and hungry for a life they could not touch. They wanted a ghost, but they were about to get a commander. If you have ever felt like an outsider in your own living room, like your worth was being measured by someone else's, yardstick, please hit the like button and comment with the word home, so I know you are listening. Your support means everything as I navigate these memories and share how I finally broke the chain. The ghost was finally coming back to haunt the fortress, but this time I was not looking for a seat at their table. I was coming to see the bill for all those years of silence. As I pulled onto Maple Street and saw the white colonial house glowing under the moon, the image of that $287 dinner receipt flashed in my mind, a stark contrast to the $32 dress I had to buy myself for graduation because they forgot to take me shopping. May 18th, 2018. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a milestone in the Miller family legacy. But for me, it was just another exercise in tactical survival. I stood in front of the hallway mirror at 47 Maple Street, smoothing down the skirt of a navy blue dress I had bought at Target for $32. It was stiff, the kind of polyester that traps heat and scratches against your skin. But it was all I could afford with my cadet stipend. Down the hall, the air smelled like expensive hairspray and floral perfume. Nicole was sliding her feet into ivory heels, her white Reformation dress shimmering in the morning light. My mother was there, hovering over her, gently smoothing out every microscopic wrinkle in the silk that had cost $218. I stood in the doorway, my hair pulled back into a regulation military bun, feeling like a smudge on a pristine canvas. My father walked past me without a glance, shoving a paper ticket into my hand as he adjusted his silk tie. He told me the family only had 4 seats in row C, and that today was Nicole's day. I was relegated to row M, seat 14, tucked away in the shadows of the balcony where I would not ruin the family photos. The auditorium was a sea of graduation gowns and suburban vanity. I sat in that plastic chair, row M, seat 14, watching the back of my parents' heads 10 rows ahead of me. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed chatter of people who used their children as social currency. When the time came for the parent-teacher tribute, my father stood up. He walked toward the podium with the practiced confidence of a man who owned the room. The microphone gave a sharp, ear-piercing screech as he adjusted it, a sound that cut through the polite applause like a serrated blade. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding Nicole in the front row, his face glowing with a pride he had never once directed toward me. He started talking about her achievements, calling her an extraordinary soul and a pillar of the community. Then, he paused. His gaze shifted, scanning the back of the hall until he found me, sitting alone in my $32 dress. A cold, dark smile touched the corners of his mouth. He leaned into the mic and told 300 people that, honestly, they probably should have stopped after their first child. He said the second one, the one sitting in the back, was just a waste of potential. Useless. The word hit me with the force of a physical strike, a round to the chest that left me breathless. I felt the blood drain from my face as a low murmur rippled through the auditorium. Then, my mother stepped up, taking the microphone from him to add her own finishing touch. She laughed and said that at least one of their 2 children made them proud. The crowd erupted. It was not a polite chuckle, it was a roar of collective mockery that shook the very foundation of the room. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the plastic armrests until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. The applause and the laughter lasted for exactly 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, I felt every biological thread connecting me to those people snap like dry kindling. The pain was there, sharp and jagged, but beneath it, a new kind of cold was settling in. I realized that the people who were supposed to be my sanctuary were actually my primary combatants. When the ceremony ended, the crowd spilled out into the bright May sunshine, everyone smiling and taking photos. I moved through the masses like a ghost, my boots clicking against the hot asphalt of the parking lot. My mother caught up to me near the car, her face flushed with the excitement of the social win. She did not apologize. Instead, she looked at me with a sharp, resentful glare and told me that I had made her look bad by sitting so far back and looking so miserable. I took 2 steps back, putting a physical barrier between us for the last time. I told her I was not going to the celebratory lunch. I told her I was done. I pulled out my phone and tapped the Uber XL app. The ride cost me $47, nearly half of what I had left in my bank account. But I did not care. 4 hours later, I was back at 47 Maple Street, the house silent and cold. I worked with a clinical military efficiency, packing 20 years of my life into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 canvas duffel bags. I did not take the furniture. I did not take the photos. I only took what belonged to the person I was becoming, not the ghost I had been. The sound of the suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor felt like a countdown. Every click of the wheels was a step closer to freedom. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the granite countertops where I had spent so many nights trying to be invisible. I pulled my house key off my ring and let it fall onto the marble island with a final, metallic ring. I did not leave a note. I did not leave a forwarding address. As I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty foyer, a single question hammered in my mind. What am I still doing here? I climbed into the back of the waiting car and watched the fortress on Maple Street disappear into the rearview mirror. I was 20 years old, I had $47 less in my pocket, and I was completely alone. But as the driver turned onto the main highway, I realized for the first time in my life, I was finally the commanding officer of my own soul. The alarm clock did not just wake me up, it felt like a direct assault on my central nervous system. 4:30. I tossed aside the thin polyester blanket that never quite managed to trap enough heat to fight off the draft coming through the window of my tiny studio. My bare feet hit the floorboards, and for a second I thought I had stepped onto a sheet of dry ice. I did not pull them back. I just stood there letting the cold travel up my shins until my nerves went numb. It was a grounding ritual, a way to remind myself that I was still solid and still here after the world I knew had evaporated. I pulled on the green Starbucks apron and the black polo shirt that smelled faintly of sour milk and old coffee grounds despite 3 washes. By 5:15, I was standing behind the massive espresso machine. The steam wand gave a high-pitched hiss as it hit the cold milk, and a stray droplet of boiling foam splattered onto the back of my hand. I did not flinch. I just wiped the burn against my apron and kept moving. 6 hours of pouring lattes for people who looked through me as if I were part of the plumbing. They did not see the cadet. They did not see the girl who had been erased from a mansion on Maple Street. They just saw a uniform. At 1400, I swapped the apron for my heavy tactical boots. They felt like lead weights on my calves as I walked into the university library. My job was simple. Move the carts. 200 books at a time. The wheels rattled against the carpeted floor, and the smell of old paper and dust filled my lungs until I felt like I was choking on history. Every book I shelved felt like a brick I was laying for a wall between me and my past. When the sun went down, I would crawl back to my 9 by 11-foot room and open a brown plastic pouch of a military MRE. The beef stew was thick and tasted mostly of salt and preservatives, but it was free. I would sit at my salvage desk, the one with the peeling laminate, and solve tactical map problems until my eyes burned. 60 hours of labor a week. I watched the numbers in my bank account grow by increments of $5 tips and minimum wage paychecks. I lost 8 kilos. My jawline became a sharp edge, and my hands grew calloused, but I had never felt more like a living, breathing person. Sophomore year ended in a haze of gray skies and silent dorm halls. I had taken a job as a resident assistant just to keep the roof over my head for free. During Thanksgiving and Christmas, the campus turned into a ghost town. The silence was absolute. I walked the empty corridors, my breath turning into white plumes of smoke in the unheated air. My phone stayed dark. No texts from the 617 area code. No calls to see if I had enough to eat or if I was cold. On New Year's Eve, I stood by the window, watching the distant fireworks over the Charles River. A vibration in my pocket made me jump. It was a text from a teammate in my ROTC unit. "You okay on watch, Miller?" I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I typed back that I was fine and that no one had ever really had my back anyway. It was the truth. I was an island. I was forged Kevlar. May 2020 arrived not with a stage or a crowd, but with a flickering Zoom link. The pandemic had locked the world down, and I was sitting in my cramped rental room wearing my crisp OCP uniform. I stood at attention in front of my laptop screen. My commanding officer's voice came through the tiny speakers, distorted and tinny, but the words were real. I picked up the gold bar of a second lieutenant. I did not have a mother to pin it on me. I did not have a father to shake my hand. I reached up and pressed the metal into the fabric of my own collar. The pins pricked my skin, and I welcomed the small sting. I turned to the window and saluted my own reflection in the dark glass. I clapped my hands, twice the sound sharp and hollow in the small room. Then I sat down at my desk, and I put my head in my hands. I did not move for 41 minutes. The tears came then not out of sadness, but out of a terrifying, overwhelming sense of pride. I had done it. I had built a human being out of the scrap metal they left behind. The transition to the medical corps and my placement at Massachusetts General Hospital felt like a different world. The salary jump was staggering, but the work was a different kind of war. One Saturday night, I was slumping over the charting desk in the ER. I was beyond exhaustion. The smell of antiseptic and blood was thick in the air, and my eyes refused to stay open. The door creaked open, and Dr. Ramos walked in. He was a veteran surgeon with hands that looked like they were made of old leather. He did not say a word. He just placed a plastic bowl of steaming chicken soup on the desk next to my elbow. The steam smelled like garlic and home. He pulled up a chair and looked directly into my eyes, his voice a low rumble. "You do not have to be a permanent fortress, Sophia," he said. I stared at the soup and then at him. He was a stranger. We shared no blood and no history. But as I took the first warm sip that burned my throat, I realized that he had seen me. He had seen the fatigue I was trying so hard to hide. It was a small act of kindness, but it shattered the shield I had spent years welding shut. I realized that the family I'd been mourning never really existed. They were just a collection of shared genes and cold expectations. But this bowl of soup given without a request or an invoice, this was what I had been starving for. I sat there in the quiet of the hospital office while the machines hummed in the distance, and for the first time I did not feel like a soldier on an island. I felt like a person who was allowed to be tired. Dr. Ramos stood up and rested a hand on my shoulder for a split second. "Go home, Captain," he said. "You have done enough for today." I knotted my throat too tight to speak. I walked out to the parking lot and found my Ford F-150. I climbed inside and gripped the steering wheel. The leather was worn and familiar. I turned the key and the engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that filled the cab. I looked at the GPS. I had already entered the address for Maple Street. My fingers hovered over the screen. The bowl of soup had done something to me. It had reminded me that while I was strong, I was still human. And it was that humanity that was finally forcing me to go back and face the people who had tried to turn me into a ghost. I put the truck in gear and pulled out into the night. The drive into Newton felt too long and yet entirely too short. The hum of the tires against the asphalt kept kicking up a fine, dry salt residue that had settled on the road after the last winter storm. A sound like sandpaper scraping against the undercarriage. It was exactly 13:58 p.m. when I finally slotted my mud-splattered Jeep into the only open space in front of the massive mailbox with the polished brass numbers 47 shimmering in the early afternoon sun. My father's silver Lexus was parked with military precision on the paved turnout, flanked by Nicole's luxury sports sedan, though hers was neglected, the tires looking low and a small drift of dead brown leaves packed into the wiper well where the blades rested. I did not turn off the engine right away. I sat there, gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel, my chest performing a steady, rhythmic cadence against my ribs. I had 3 rules of engagement for this infiltration of my past. I would not eat or drink anything they offered. I would keep my visit under 15 minutes unless absolutely necessary. And I would concede nothing. This was a tactical rescue, not a reunion. And I had to maintain the mental perimeter I'd spent 7 years welding together. I killed the ignition and pushed open the heavy oak double doors, and the scent of the house hit me instantly. It was not the smell of home, but a sickeningly sweet wave of industrial vanilla-scented wax trying to mask the aroma of damp dust and old money. My mother erupted from the kitchen doorway like a hurricane of flowing linen and performance tears, her arms outspread for a hug she had not earned since I was 20 years old. I did not even think about it. I just snapped my left hand up, palm out, a hard physical block that stopped her cold in the air between us. She froze, the sob catching in her throat, her eyes wide with shock. I did not look at her face. I looked past her to the marble fireplace mantel, 12 silver frames, 12 portraits of perfection. Nicole at graduation. Nicole laughing with a glass of champagne. Nicole skiing in Aspen. There was not a single scrap of paper or a single pixel of light indicating that Captain Sophia Miller had ever existed, let alone grown up within these walls. My father was sitting in his large leather club chair, slowly swirling a glass of dark bourbon. The low, rhythmic clink of the single ice cube against the crystal was the only sound in the suffocatingly quiet room. He did not rise to greet me. He barely even looked up. He took a sip, let the liquid burn his throat, and then started speaking in that smooth, condescending voice he reserved for people he deemed less intelligent. He said Nicole was not one of those street junkies. He said she was in pain after a minor car accident, a lie he repeated with conviction, and that the doctors had prescribed the medication. I walked directly to the glass-topped coffee table and slammed the thick medical folder I carried down onto the surface. The crack was sharp and echoed through the room like a gunshot. I leaned down, getting into his space, my voice low and clinical. I told him that crushing oxycodone, shopping around to 3 different doctors for scripts, and then sticking needles into her veins was the precise medical definition of a junkie pop. I did not say it angrily. I said it like I was reading a situation report. That did it. My mother screamed, the performance mask slipping away, revealing the pure venom beneath. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest and told me it was my fault. She said that if I had not abandoned the family 7 years ago, if I had stayed and supported my sister instead of playing soldier, Nicole would not have fallen. It was such a cheap, pathetic attempt at psychological manipulation that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I just stood up straight, fastened the top button of my uniform coat, and looked her in the eye. I did not flinch. I told her that she was not going to blame me for the pile of garbage she had spent years building with her own hands, just like she blamed me for not growing wings like Nicole was supposed to have. I was not the cause, I was just the cleanup crew they decided to call. I did not wait for a response. I did not care about their excuses. I just spun on my heel and walked to the base of the staircase that led to the second floor, my combat boots hitting the wooden stairs with a heavy, methodical thud. The wooden staircase was the same dark, polished oak it had always been, a surface designed to showcase the finest furniture polish, not tactical gear. Every heavy step I took, every deliberate thud of my boot on the polished wood, echoed through the empty foyer like a countdown. I set my foot on the first step. The wood groaned slightly. The sound was distinct and loud against the muffled silence of the living room I left behind. Then, the next. And the next. One step at a time, I began to ascend. The rhythm of my climb measured and relentless, matching the heartbeat of a commander securing a perimeter. I was ascending toward the dark heart of this fortress, toward the secret they had been trying so hard to hide from the neighbors and themselves, a place where the pristine facade of Maple Street dissolved into the raw, rotting reality of human failure. The heavy wooden door to Nicole's bedroom did not creak as I turned the handle. Instead, it gave a long, exhausted sigh, as if the room itself were tired of holding back the secrets of the past year. I stepped inside, and a wall of stagnant air hit me squarely in the face, a foul chemical cocktail of unwashed hair, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of dried vomit. The thick velvet curtains were drawn so tight that not a single sliver of the afternoon sun could penetrate the darkness, leaving the space in a permanent, suffocating twilight. This was the headquarters of the Golden Child, a place once filled with high-end fashion and the smell of expensive perfume, now reduced to a dark bunker for a skeletal shadow. In the far corner of the designer rug, I saw her. The girl who used to wear $200 silk dresses was curled into a tight ball like a dying insect, her hair matted against her skull in greasy, neglected clumps. Her frame had wasted away so severely that her collarbones looked like jagged ridges under her skin, her weight clearly dropping into a dangerous range. When she finally looked up at me, the blue light from her phone screen cast a ghostly, sickly pallor over her hollow cheeks, revealing eyes that were no longer those of a student leader, but those of a prisoner of war. I dropped to one knee on the hardwood floor, ignoring the dust and the grime that stained my uniform. Nicole reached out, her fingers trembling with a violent palsy as she clawed at the stiff camouflage fabric of my sleeve. She began to sob, but there was no sound, only a jagged and rhythmic gasping for air that made my own chest tighten in sympathy. She whispered that the room was a cage and that the pressure to be the perfect daughter had been a noose tightening around her neck every single day of her life. She told me that the pills were the only thing that could make the noise stop, the only thing that could silence our father's booming voice of expectation that echoed in her head every time she closed her eyes. They stopped the constant reminders that she was not a daughter, but a high-stakes investment that had to pay off for the family brand. As I held her, I realized that my childhood enemy was just another victim of the empire our parents had built. The resentment I had carried for 7 years began to transform into a cold, hollow sorrow for the girl who was forced to be a masterpiece while she was rotting from the inside out. Nicole scrambled toward her nightstand, her heels dragging across the floor with a dry scratching sound, and pulled a cracked iPhone from under a mountain of dirty clothes. She looked me in the eye, her mascara running in black streaks down her face, and told me that she had tried to reach me. She said she had sent a desperate SOS months ago, begging me to come back and save her. But I had never answered her cries. She pressed her shaky thumb against the screen, the glass shards biting into her skin, and shoved the phone into my hand. I opened the sent folder, my breath catching in my throat as I found an email from September 2023. The subject line simply read, "I cannot do this anymore. Please help me." My heart skipped a beat when I looked at the recipient line. The email had been sent to smiller@gmail.com. My actual address is sophiamiller@gmail.com. Someone had surgically removed the first 5 letters of my identity, ensuring her plea for help landed in a digital void. I felt a surge of cold fury that made my vision blur as the reality of the deception settled into my bones. I tapped into the contact settings and began to scroll deep into the edit history of the phone with a clinical precision. There it was, the smoking gun. The last modification to my contact entry had been made in June 2023. That was the exact month Nicole had been unconscious in the hospital following her first car accident. My parents had sat by her bedside, pretending to be the grieving, prayerful couple, while they were actually using her thumbprint to unlock her phone and delete my name from her digital life. They did not just want to exclude the useless daughter. They wanted to intentionally cut the only lifeline their golden child had left, just to ensure I never found out about the rot inside their house. They had sacrificed her health and her sanity to maintain their pristine suburban image. I shoved the phone into my chest pocket and stood up, my combat boots clicking against the floor with a lethal, metallic finality. I was no longer just a doctor or a sister. I was a witness to a calculated betrayal. I looked back at Nicole and told her to stay exactly where she was, and that the siege on this room was finally almost over. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding a war drum against my ribs, each beat fueling the fire of my indignation. I had the grenade in my pocket, the blue light of that cracked screen still burned into my retinas, and I was heading downstairs to pull the pin in front of the people who thought they could play God with our lives. The silence of the hallway felt heavy as I stepped out, but I carried the noise of Nicole's silent screams with me. There would be no more hiding and no more saving face for the Millers on Maple Street. If you have ever discovered that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones pulling the strings to keep you isolated and silenced, please hit that like button and comment with the word truth. Your engagement helps me share this story of breaking the digital chains and reclaiming my voice. I charged down the wooden steps, the rhythmic thud of my boots echoing through the hollow foyer like a drumbeat for a court-martial. Nicole stumbled along behind me, her breathing a series of shallow, ragged hitches as she clutched the railing for support, her tattered sweater sleeves trailing in the dust. I did not slow down until I reached the center of the living room where my parents sat in their climate-controlled comfort, surrounded by silver-framed lies. I reached into my chest pocket and pulled out her cracked iPhone, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged glass of the screen. I did not set it down. I slammed it onto the tempered glass coffee table with enough force that the entire surface groaned and the bourbon in my father's glass jumped in a violent amber wave. I pointed my finger directly at the chief accountant, the man who had spent 40 years balancing books while his own house was in the red. You modified her contacts last June while she was unconscious in a hospital bed. Eleanor and you were right there with him, Sophia. You surgically removed my identity from her life so she could not call the one person who would actually tell the truth about this rotting foundation. I watched my mother's hand shake so violently, she dropped the silver ice tongs and they clattered into the bucket with a sharp metallic ringing that sounded like an alarm. My father did not apologize or shrink back into his chair. Instead, he lunged forward, his face turning a shade of purple I had only seen in trauma bays just before a cardiac arrest. He slammed his fist onto the leather armrest, and his voice was a low, dangerous snarl that sprayed tiny flecks of spit into the air. You think you are so righteous in that uniform, Sophia, but you do not have the slightest clue about the real world or the stakes of this family. Do you have any idea what a drug addiction in the immediate family does to a top-secret security clearance at the Department of Defense? I have spent 3 decades building a reputation that allows me to handle the most sensitive contracts in this country, and I was not about to let a junkie daughter and a failure of a second child burn it all down for a headline. I had to quarantine the information, and I had to protect the perimeter of our lives from your interference. He was not defending his daughter. He was defending his access to classified spreadsheets. The room went deathly quiet as the weight of his admission settled into the plush carpet. I saw Nicole shrink into herself, her eyes wide and glassy as she realized she was not a person to him, but a security risk line item that needed to be redacted. I moved closer to the table, my shadow falling over his bourbon glass. Here is the thing, Pop. You threw her a diamond chain of expectations, and when she started strangling herself with it because she was afraid to tarnish your precious clearance, you called me in to hide the body and keep the neighbors from whispering. You did not want a doctor. You wanted a high-ranking conspirator. I reached into my tactical pants and pulled out my small medical notebook, flipping to a fresh white page with a crisp sound. I shoved a ballpoint pen and the blank paper toward him. You are going to write a check for $28,500 made out to Serenity Ridge. It is a 90-day inpatient facility, and they have a bed waiting for her tonight. My father's teeth were gritted so hard I could hear the enamel grind. He snatched the pen up, but he did not write. He told me he would be the one choosing the facility since it was his money paying for the treatment. I leaned over the table, my palms flat on the glass, as I stared him down with the same intensity I used to hold a perimeter during a mass casualty event. You sign that check, and you lose every single ounce of access to her life. No phone calls to check on your investment, no visiting hours to lecture her on her grades, no more digital sabotage. From this second on, you are outside my perimeter, and you do not get to speak unless I give you the order. I watched his hand tremble as he pressed the pen into the paper so hard it tore through the corner of the checkbook. He scribbled the numbers with a frantic, jagged motion, and the ink bled into the fibers of the paper like a blue stain on his pristine reputation. He threw the check at me, and it fluttered through the air like a white flag of surrender. My mother rushed forward, her face a mess of smeared mascara and desperate grief as she grabbed the stiff camouflage fabric of my sleeve. She asked about our family and about the home we had built together as if she were reading from a script for a bad Hallmark movie. I looked at the red polish on her fingers as she clawed at my arm, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I peeled her fingers off one by one and stepped back into the clear air of the foyer. There is no family here, Eleanor. There is only this house and a security clearance, and I resigned from both of them 7 years ago. I turned to Nicole and signaled for her to grab her bag, her movements slow and stiff, like a soldier recovering from a blast. I jangled my car keys in the silence, a sharp, rhythmic sound that signaled the end of the mission. We walked toward the front door, and I did not look back at the portraits of perfection on the mantel. I stepped out onto the porch, and the heavy oak door swung shut behind us with a solid final thud that vibrated through the floorboards and echoed down the driveway. The fortress on Maple Street was finally silent, and for the first time in 27 years, I could actually breathe. I put Nicole into the passenger seat of my truck and climbed behind the wheel, the leather cold and firm against my back. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, leaving the silver Lexus and the white Colonial behind, in the settling dust of a life I was finally finished living. It was exactly 8:03 a.m. when I tossed Nicole's ragged canvas duffel bag into the back of my Jeep. The sound of the trunk slamming shut was loud and final, echoing off the white siding of the house that had stopped being a home 7 years ago. My parents stood on the stone porch like two frozen statues of a failed era. My father with his arms crossed in a defensive posture, and my mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that was more of a prop than a tool. They did not come down the stairs. They did not offer a hand. They just watched as their golden investment was loaded into a mud-splattered vehicle driven by the daughter they had labeled as useless. Nicole climbed into the passenger seat, her movements stiff and uncoordinated, her gaze fixed entirely on the dashboard as if she were afraid the house might pull her back in if she looked at it one last time. I didn't say a word to them. I just climbed behind the wheel, the worn leather of the seat familiar and grounding, and pulled out of the driveway. The tires rolled over the dry salt and crushed leaves on the pavement, leaving 47 Maple Street behind in a cloud of dust and silence. We spent 2 hours and 38 minutes on the Massachusetts Turnpike, a long stretch of gray asphalt cutting through a landscape of skeletal trees and winter fog. The silence inside the cabin was thick, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the whistling of the wind against the windshield. Nicole sat huddled in her oversized sweater, her fingers constantly picking at the bloody skin around her cuticles, a nervous habit that left small red stains on the fabric. Actually, I realized as I watched her through my peripheral vision, we weren't just sisters anymore. We were two survivors of the same minefield. For years I thought she was the lucky one, the one who got the silk curtains and the $3,000 vanity, while I was the ghost in the basement. But as I looked at her hollow cheeks and the way her hands shook, I saw the truth. "Do you have any resentment for me, Sophia?" she finally whispered, her voice so thin it barely carried over the road noise. I adjusted the rearview mirror, watching a silver sedan fade into the distance. I told her that hatred takes too much energy and that we were both just prisoners of war in that house. I told her she was locked in a glass cage while I was locked in a cellar, and the only real difference was that I had dug my way out 7 years earlier. The sky was a heavy shade of slate when we pulled into the gravel lot of Serenity Ridge. It was a low-slung brick building tucked behind a line of towering pines, a place that felt more like a quiet infirmary than a prison, though the fences told a different story. We walked through the automatic glass doors and into a lobby that smelled of industrial floor wax and stale chamomile tea. The intake nurse was a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard that looked like it had seen 1,000 tragedies just like ours. She handed Nicole a plastic bin and began the process of stripping away the last of the golden child's identity. I watched as Nicole reached up with trembling fingers to unlatch her expensive watch, the one our parents had bought her for her vice presidency, and dropped it into the plastic with a hollow clatter. Then came the iPhone with the cracked screen, the device that had been used to isolate her from the only person who cared. The most jarring part was when the nurse asked her to remove her shoelaces. It is a standard suicide prevention protocol, a cold reminder of how close to the edge she really was. Nicole sat on a hard plastic chair, pulling the white laces through the eyelets of her sneakers with a slow, clumsy rhythm, her pride replaced by a quiet, desperate compliance. The golden child of the Miller Empire was gone, and in her place was a person who was finally, painfully, real. Before the nurse led her through the magnetic doors to the residential wing, Nicole stopped and turned back toward me. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't look at me with condescension or pity. She looked at me with the eyes of someone who was finally seeing the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. She stepped forward and wrapped her thin, bony arms around my neck, burying her face into the stiff fabric of my camouflage uniform coat. She sobbed into my shoulder, a deep, jagged sound that vibrated through my own chest. And for a moment, the 7 years of silence and betrayal seemed to melt into the floor. I patted her back twice, a rhythmic, grounding gesture I'd learned in the field, and whispered that the mission was over. Then the nurse touched her arm, and Nicole stepped away, disappearing through the heavy doors. The magnetic lock engaged with a sharp, mechanical click that felt like the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I never wanted to read again. I walked back out to the Jeep alone, the air feeling colder and sharper than it had an hour before. I climbed into the cabin and sat there for a long time, the engine off and the heater slowly dying away. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, the leather pressing into my skin, and let the silence of the woods wash over me. The adrenaline that had carried me from the hospital to Newton and then here was finally evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like a physical weight. I had secured the perimeter and I had evacuated the casualty, but as I sat in the gathering shadows of the pines, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning. I wasn't just a soldier or a sister anymore. I was a person who had to figure out how to live in a world that wasn't a battlefield. I reached out and turned the key, the engine roaring to life with a guttural growl that filled the empty space, and I put the truck in gear. I had a lot of work to do, but as I pulled out onto the highway, the headlights cutting a path through the dark, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away from anything. The blue light from my laptop screen was the only thing illuminating my small studio apartment as the clock hit 1900 hours. It was the second month of Nicole's residential treatment at Serenity Ridge, and our weekly family therapy sessions had moved to a secure digital link. I sat there in my gray hoodie watching the spinning loading icon until the screen finally split into two distinct rectangles of reality. On the left was Nicole. She was sitting in a sun-drenched common room wearing a plain navy sweatshirt that did not cost $200. Actually, she looked like a human being again. She had gained 4 kilos and the hollow gray shadows under her cheekbones had been replaced by a faint, healthy pink. She looked directly into the webcam and her voice came through the speakers without the jagged trembling of a withdrawal. She told the counselor that she had finally figured out that being loved by our parents was not a gift or a blessing. She said it was a slave contract with fine print that stripped away your soul. I did not cry. I did not offer a sentimental platitude. I just leaned forward and made a note in my leather-bound logbook. I told her that identifying the breach of contract was the first step toward a successful evacuation. We did not mention the house on Maple Street. We did not talk about the luxury cars or the booze. We spent 40 minutes discussing the mechanics of living an independent life and how to build a budget that did not rely on someone else's approval. By December 2025, the winter had settled into the city with a biting dampness that made the brick buildings feel like ice chests. I came home after a double shift at the hospital, my boots heavy with slush, and checked the small metal mailbox in the lobby. Tucked between a gas bill and a flyer for a local pizza joint was a heavy cream-colored envelope. The paper was embossed with a fine linen texture that felt expensive under my calloused thumb. I knew the handwriting before I even looked at the return address. It was my mother's perfect cursive, the kind of loops and swirls that were taught in private schools decades ago. I walked into my apartment and set the envelope on the kitchen counter next to my cold coffee. I did not rush to open it. I took off my uniform coat and hung it up. I washed my hands. Only then did I use a steak knife to slit the top of the paper. Inside was a generic holiday card featuring a family sitting by a fireplace looking nauseatingly happy. Tucked inside the card was a bank check for $5,000. There was a short note written in blue ink. It said the money was for my student loans, and then it added 3 words that made my jaw tighten. Come home, Sophia. They still believe that every bridge could be rebuilt with a high enough bid. They thought my 7 years of survival and my sister's near-death experience could be erased with a mid-sized check and a holiday greeting. I did not even finish reading the second sentence. I walked over to the corner of my living area where my small office setup sat under a single desk lamp. I flipped the switch on the heavy-duty paper shredder I had bought after the Newton incident. The machine gave a low rhythmic humming sound as the blades began to spin. I took the $5,000 check and the embossed card and I fed them into the narrow slot. I watched as the steel teeth grabbed the paper and turned the parental olive branch into 1,000 tiny strips of white and cream confetti. That money represented months of sleep deprivation and 60-hour work weeks from my younger years, and watching it disappear felt better than any bank deposit ever had. I sat down and opened my phone, scrolling through the settings until I reached the blocked callers list. I added 3 more numbers, the home lines of aunts and cousins who had recently started leaving me voicemails about the importance of family unity during the holidays. It was a clean, tactical sweep. I was not being cruel. I was simply maintaining the integrity of my defensive perimeter. A week later, I was sitting in the small office of Dr. Ramos at the clinic. The room smelled like old books and the faint aroma of the peppermint tea he always kept on his desk. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses, looking over the top of his clipboard at me. I told him about the $5,000 check and the sound of the shredder. He asked me if I felt a sense of guilt or if I felt like I was denying them a chance to make amends. I looked at the small American flag sitting on his bookshelf, and then I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that ignoring a repeated pattern of betrayal was not a sign of nobility or high character. I told him it was a form of emotional suicide. Actually, I said the word suicide with a flat clinical tone because that is exactly what it was. Every time I let them back in, they took a piece of the person I'd spent years building, and they replaced it with shame. Ramos stopped writing. He stared at me for a long beat, and then he slowly closed his folder with a satisfied snap. He gave me a small, thin smile and reached for his pen. He wrote 2 words at the bottom of my progress report in large, bold letters. Mental status, excellent. I stood up and shook his hand, feeling the solid grip of a man who understood the cost of a long campaign. I walked out of the clinic and into the crisp afternoon air of the city. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, but for the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was being chased by them. The weight of the $5,000 check was gone, replaced by the light feeling of a clean slate. I headed toward my truck and checked my watch. I had a dinner date with Nicole at a small diner near her sober living house. She was moving out of the facility next month, and we were going to look at some studio apartments in the city. As I pulled out into the traffic, the engine of my truck gave a steady, reassuring growl. I was not going back to the house on Maple Street for Christmas. I was not going back to be the useless daughter or the high-ranking maid. I was heading toward a table for two, where the only thing on the menu was the truth, and the bill was already paid in full. The air in the Boston suburbs had finally lost its winter bite, replaced by the sweet scent of damp earth and blooming dogwood. It was February 2026, and the afternoon sun was hitting the pavement of the Sidewalk Cafe with a gentle warmth that made the world feel new. I was sitting at a small round metal table, holding a heavy ceramic mug of Americano, so dark it looked like motor oil. I took a sip. It was bitter and hot, just the way I liked it. Across from me sat Nicole, and for a second I just watched her breathe. She looked solid. Her skin had that healthy glow of someone who finally had a regular sleep schedule, and the deep gray circles that used to haunt her eyes had retreated. 10 months. That was the number we were celebrating today. 10 months since she had walked out of the heavy magnetic doors of Serenity Ridge and into a studio apartment that she paid for with her own wages from the bookstore. She was drinking a green smoothie and talking about her developmental psychology midterms with a kind of focus I had never seen in her before. She reached across the table to grab a napkin, and I noticed her hands. They were steady. No more tremors and no more clawing at the air. Then the conversation shifted into the territory we usually avoided. She told me she had started allowing Eleanor and our father 30 minutes of supervised contact once a month at a neutral location. She said she needed to face the architects of her damage to finally move forward into her own life. I listened to her and I respected the tactical choice she was making for her own recovery, but I told her my perimeter remained closed. I did not need to see the wreckage of the ship that tried to sink me just to prove I could swim. The following Saturday, my small backyard was a haze of hickory smoke and the sound of classic rock drifting from a portable speaker on the deck. This was the first warm weekend of the year, and my unit from the hospital was out in force. Dev was hunched over the charcoal grill, flipping racks of baby back ribs that sizzled and spat fat into the glowing embers. The smell of charring meat and sweet vinegar sauce hung heavy in the air, and it felt better than any expensive dinner in Newton ever had. Sarah shoved a cold, long-neck bottle of beer into my hand, the condensation immediately soaking into my palm and making my skin tingle. We were not talking about trauma or surgeries or the broken people we fixed every day in the ER. We were just being human. We were shouting over each other and telling the kind of dirty jokes that only people who have seen the raw reality of an emergency room can truly appreciate. There was no judgment here, and no one cared about the thread count of my sheets or the prestige of my zip code. No one was looking over my head for a better person to talk to. I looked around at these people, these medics and nurses and surgeons, and I realized that this was my actual blood. This was the chosen family I had forged in the heat of 1,000 different crises, and they were the ones who actually had my back when the world went dark. My phone gave a sharp staccato vibration in my pocket against my thigh. I pulled it out and saw a notification for a voicemail from an unrecognized area code. I stepped away from the noise of the grill and the laughter of my friends walking to the far corner of the yard where the grass was still a bit overgrown. I held the phone to my ear. It was my mother. Her voice sounded thin and fragile like old parchment paper that was about to crumble. She said, "Sophia, we are getting old and life is too short for this kind of distance." She said it was time to just forget the past and be a family again, because they missed having their daughters around for the holidays. I stood there watching a plume of white smoke rise from the grill and disappear into the perfectly clear blue Massachusetts sky. I did not feel a surge of anger, and I did not feel that old familiar weight of guilt pressing down on my chest like a lead plate. I felt absolutely nothing but a deep clinical quiet. It was like looking at a situation report for a conflict that had ended years ago. I hit the delete button before she even finished the sentence. I watched the screen flicker as the message was purged, and then I went into the settings and wiped the digital trash. There was no hesitation, and there was no looking back at the ruins of 47 Maple Street. The ghost was finally gone. I walked back toward the deck and leaned my weight against the wooden railing, feeling the solid grain of the timber under my palms. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my shirt, feeling the small cold metal ridge of my captain's bars rubbing against my skin. People love to talk about healing as if it is a soft and gentle thing. They tell you that true peace is when you can sit down at the table with your enemies and sign a treaty of forgiveness. They tell you that blood is thicker than water and that you owe the people who gave you life a permanent seat in your home. Here is the thing. They are wrong. Healing is not about reconciliation with the people who broke you, and it is not about making the abusers feel better about their choices. Healing is about building a steel perimeter around your life and your sanity. It is about realizing that you do not owe anyone a second chance to destroy you just because you share a piece of DNA. I watched Dev pull the ribs off the grill, and Sarah handed me a plate of food that smelled like summer and freedom. I was going to eat, and I was going to laugh until my lungs hurt. And tonight I was going to go to bed and sleep through the night without a single ghost in the room. I was a commander of my own life, and the perimeter was holding. The story of Sophia Miller serves as a profound educational reminder that family is not defined solely by a shared bloodline, but by the respect and safety provided within a relationship. True resilience is found when an individual stops seeking validation from those determined to misunderstand them. Sophia's journey teaches us that setting an absolute boundary with toxic influences is not an act of malice, but an essential step in self-preservation. When the past is used as a weapon of control, choosing to walk away is the only way to reclaim one's future and dignity. If Sophia's struggle felt familiar, or if you have ever had to build your own steel perimeter to protect your peace, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of strength and independence inspire others who may still be trapped in their own fortresses of silence. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support more stories of survival and self-empowerment. Your engagement ensures that these voices of resilience continue to be heard.